You say, addiction, the big terrible thing, is far too powerful for anyone to defeat alone. But together, one day at a time, we can beat it down.
Hello and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner Podcast. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to continue to learn from me about addiction and mental health, science, and treatment. Today I want to spend some time talking about Matthew Perry. There's been some recent news around Matthew Perry's tragic passing and his family's quest for justice and ultimately what I hope will bring some closure to them as they process his tragic and untimely death. Perry, who had a long-standing history of addiction and mental health struggles, died in October 2023 from an accidental ketamine overdose. Salvador Plasencia, one of two doctors charged with illegal distribution of ketamine in Matthew Perry's overdose case, was the first to be sentenced out of 5 individuals who are facing charges related to his death, all of whom have pled guilty. First, my take on his situation and the contributing factors to his death is that quality care for addiction, as well as mental health, is really not easy to find. And that struggle is different for different subgroups of people. For high-profile people or people with access to wealth and resources, there's this potential for unethical, crooked professionals to really exploit them. And that can lead individuals who practice medicine to allow greed to drive their clinical decisions.
Plasencia cried and nodded in agreement as Perry's family accused him of betraying his Hippocratic oath. Perry's sister saying, instead of protecting him, you exploited him. And his mother standing before Plasencia saying, I just want you to see his mother. This is his mother.
These are often criminal minds and criminal behaviors that really need to be stopped. And that really was an important step that was taken by Perry's family, really to expose those who contributed to his death and to seek justice. I've seen this in my practice and also as a licensed healthcare professional living in Los Angeles. I've had sort of a close-up view to what can happen when people with power and status seek mental health care or addiction care and how this can go awry. And what I've seen is that, probably not surprising to many of you, power and status can really become a destructive force for somebody who's addicted. Because if you have a medical professional who we all know have the power to heal or harm you, medical professionals are human and they can become starstruck and they can become wrapped up in this desire to become part of the fame and status of a high-profile person who's in need of help. That can really lead them astray from professional ethics and sound clinical decision making. And this can happen even with people who have good intentions.
Look, it's a tragic story, and sometimes apparently nice guys do bad things, and the legal system has to take account of it.
And I think he's right. We know that medical professionals hold a lot of power, and ultimately they can kill someone with addiction just by giving them what they say they need. So to effectively treat somebody with power and status, particularly when they have addiction, you have to be a special kind of professional. You have to be somebody with not only expertise in the psychology of addiction and addictive behaviors, but you also have to know how to say no. And you also have to have a really strong sense of yourself as a person and a professional. Otherwise, you do risk doing serious harm. And to me, this also mirrors the struggle that people who have a loved one in their family with an addiction often go through. It's not even that different. They're going to be pushed by that person with an addiction to cover for them when their addiction leads them to fail in certain areas of their life, to help them minimize the harms that their addiction is doing, probably with very best intentions to feed and fuel their addiction by enabling them to continue to have access to the substance that they're addicted to, whether they do that directly by asking you to supply them with alcohol when they're in withdrawal or with pills when they're in withdrawal, or by asking for money. And I've seen so many families go through this struggle where they don't want to see their loved one out on the street. They don't want to say no. They want to be helpful. They want to help them survive and thrive, and they really just don't know how to. And what we often refer to as enabling, and I've talked with many people on my podcast about this theme, is that their family members and even trusted professionals in their life were stepping in and helping them to sort of maintain a certain level of substance use to avoid going into withdrawal. And in some circles, we refer to that as enabling behavior. And when we say enabling, we mean sort of enabling their addiction to continue to develop and to worsen. And that often does come with good intentions. But when you insulate someone from the consequences of their addiction or the potential negative consequences, often you really delay the process of them seeking help that they desperately need in order to overcome the problem. In my book, the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook, I did review some of the characteristics of a treatment professional and their expertise that you would be looking for if you're looking for help for someone you love with addiction or if you yourself have addiction. And I think that sadly, a lot of what has been reflected in this case with Matthew Perry is the fact that quality care is really hard to come by. And again, for people with limited resources, it can be hard to come by because it's hard to get to, it's hard to access, it's too expensive. So you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to be prepared to consult a lot of resources and trusted professionals who you do know and have a relationship with, and also maybe people in your life who you know and trust or can come to trust to ask them for a recommendation. But also guidelines are really important, and Shatterproof as an organization has really developed guidelines for what constitutes quality care. They have a list of treatment programs and treatment providers that provide what's considered to be quality evidence-based care. And that's a really important takeaway from this, because again, whether you have limited resources or whether you have a lot of resources, you can still fall into that trap, placing your life in the hands of people who either aren't qualified or don't have your best interest in mind. So that's part of my take on Matthew Perry's situation. My second reflection on Matthew Perry is that his addiction was quite severe and complex. There is no denying that. But he was not beyond help. In October of 2022, about a year before he died, he spoke with Diane Sawyer in a very candid and moving conversation about his addiction and recovery.
55 Vicodin a day, which is where I was.
55.
Yeah.
Now, you don't hear someone say that they've taken as many as 55 Vicodin in a day all that often. It really is a testament to the severity of the addiction that Perry was living with. But I think when we think about that severe end of the addiction spectrum, as Perry reflected on what pushed him more deeply into his addiction and what helped him, he spoke about the impact of trying to keep people from finding out about it.
Secrets kill you. Secrets kill people like me.
It's a really powerful reminder that the shame of addiction can really lead people to turn inward. And when they're alone with it, it only gets worse. And so why is that? We understand addiction as a chronic disease that impacts brain functioning. And what happens is that addiction develops and gets stronger is that your mind ends up in this sort of internal dialogue that is extremely irrational. But the internal dialogue is all geared towards sustaining the addiction because your brain has become dependent on that substance to feel normal or to try to feel normal. And so your brain is telling you that you need it above and beyond everything else. And so when you're trapped alone with your thoughts and you're trapped in solitude with those secrets, it can be very depressing, very isolating, and it really only serves to fuel that addictive process and make it stronger rather than weaker. So it just becomes much easier to deceive yourself. And as Matthew reflected, addiction is lonely.
Addiction, the big terrible thing, is far too powerful for anyone to defeat alone. But together, one day at a time, we can beat it down.
Yeah.
And while there are many ways to heal, there's one common thread through all of our different psychotherapy strategies, all the different types of treatment programs, whether it's group or individual, or whether it's residential, like an inpatient setting or an outpatient setting. One thing that gets emphasized through all the different types of therapies is that social support is really critical to recovering from this illness. It is a really key component of what enables people to recover.
She was the one that reached out the most. I'm really grateful to her for that.
And we know from studies that social support is one of the things that really differentiates people who have better longer term outcomes from treatment than people who don't fare quite as well. So today I would really like for you to think about somebody who you've been worried about, whether it's because they have a mental health issue or an addiction issue or some other kind of issue, but you just haven't gotten around to reaching out to them. Maybe it's because you're short on time. Maybe because you're avoiding reaching out at some level, whether you're conscious of that or whether it's more subconscious, because it's a little scary to reach out. You don't know what you're going to get in return. You don't know if the person's okay. You don't know if the person is going to lean on you for support in a way that might be difficult for you. But the reason I'm saying this, to reach out to somebody who you've thought about but you haven't, is because just as Matthew Perry reflected, maybe Jennifer didn't know every time she was reaching out just how much it meant to him, especially if he wasn't in a great state of mind. But even just letting a person know that you're there and that you're thinking about them and letting them know that you are there for them if they need you can give them a reason to try to better themselves or to resist giving up on life. And we see this as well with regards to reducing suicide risk for people. Some of the things that are reported by people who struggle with suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors is that some supportive person or people in their life, knowing that they were there, knowing that they cared, made a lot of difference for them. So another reflection that I had was that recovery really comes back to finding meaning and purpose. We talk about this a lot on my podcast, and it sounds very simple, and in some ways it is, but it isn't so easy to get there. And on the surface, Matthew Perry's meaning and purpose was really clear to most of the world, right? He was there to bring other people joy and laughter, and he was so darn good at it. But that wasn't enough for him. That didn't keep him from his addiction. What he expressed in his interview with Diane Sawyer was really that the suffering in his addiction ended up giving him really a deeper sense of purpose to motivate his recovery.
And helping others had become the answer for me.
And I believe this desire to help people was very sincere. And when the rational part of his brain was working, this is genuinely what he wanted. And what drove him to do all the good things, writing his book, committing to his recovery, taking good care of his health. And this is something we often see in addiction, is that when you're in the throes of an active addiction, there's the part of your brain that's working overtime is the addicted part of your brain. And it's telling you to do all these things that are very self-destructive in the interest of supporting that habit and keeping it going. And what we're trying to do in recovery, when you have enough time behind you and space and clarity of mind, just from the substances leaving your body and your brain to see the bigger picture, that's when you start to see a little bit of definition coming to light around what your meaning and purpose might be and how it relates to the struggle that you've experienced. But you need enough time behind you to get some of those substances out of your system that are likely clouding your reasoning, your judgment, and your ability to self-reflect, because that's a highly cognitively demanding kind of ability for self-reflection. So if Matt Perry was sincere, he had this genuine desire to help people, he seemed to really be on the right path, not so long before we lost him. So the question becomes then, what went wrong? He was on this course to sustained recovery, but he wasn't able to stay the course. And he knew how hard it was to avoid getting derailed in his recovery.
Your disease is just outside, just doing one-arm push-ups, just waiting for you, waiting to get you alone. Because alone, you lose.
So he was totally right about this. In addiction recovery, one of the trickiest parts is that when your addicted brain starts to talk to you, it compels you to go off and be alone to feed it. And it seems like Matthew had the awareness of that. There are a lot of reasons that a person's addicted brain can get triggered, even when they're doing just fine in recovery. And we know now from research studies on recovery and the way that the brain heals during the course of addiction recovery, that there are literally changes in the brain that happen along the way that lead them to be able to have some of the sort of insights and the sound mind and judgment to avoid slipping back into some of those same patterns. But for some people, it can take up to 8 years to get to that point and 4 or 5 treatment episodes. But if they do get there, they are able to sustain a life in recovery. When a person's in recovery, some of the reasons that they can get triggered is mostly when they get exposed to cues that bring on those urges to return to substance use, and they can really come rushing back in when you least expect them to. That's part of why really being armed with a plan to prevent relapse is so incredibly important. In Matthew Perry's case, that trigger was likely ketamine. While ketamine has a lot of research behind it for people who have mental health issues that are resistant to other forms of treatment, and that was the way that Matthew Perry initially started to use it for people with severe addiction history like his, it really could become a trigger from the way that it acts on the brain to other addictive behaviors, leading a person to develop what's known as a ketamine use disorder. So an addiction to ketamine, it's not the most common thing, but in the case of somebody like Matthew Perry, I would have expected that he would be highly likely to develop this type of problem in relation to ketamine. So all you can really do in recovery is work towards being mentally stronger than the illness, because it's true what Perry says, that illness is going to be there in the background, likely for a lifetime for someone with an addiction history as severe as Perry's, certainly. And it's something that you have to be mindful of, trying to keep it in check and really doing sort of ongoing work to prevent a slip up or a relapse. And when you love someone with an addiction, really the best you can do is to watch and listen for those signs. And you really treat them like cues that tell you that it's rearing its ugly head again. But the truth of the matter is, as family members of people who love someone with an addiction, we are not genies. We don't predict the future. We don't pick up on every single cue, but we can try to listen and respond if we see some of those cues.
How will we know when you're in trouble?
If I say, I'm just going to chill alone at home tonight.
The thing about isolation is true for many people, but sometimes it's really difficult to detect isolation as a family member, because people with addiction and mental health issues are good at flying under the radar when they don't really want to be noticed. So it's something to be attuned to. If you have somebody in your life whom you love who has an addiction, if you feel like you haven't been hearing from them quite as much or quite in the same way, that would be a point to check in. And if you're someone who has a child or children with addiction, I think Matthew Perry's reflections on how his parents fit into the overall picture is something that you need to hear.
Perry says he's proof that addiction can enter any home, any heart, even one with golden parents.
So when I wrote my most recent book on addiction, I had a longtime colleague of mine who I told, my book is coming out. It's a general interest book, addiction, what everyone needs to know. She was like, I can't wait to read it. And by the way, I really hope you have a section in there about how it's not your fault if your child or children grow up to struggle with addiction, because she has seen so many families struggle with that guilt. That's something I've run across as well in my practice and with some of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, is that it's hard not to go there when you have a child who struggles with addiction. What could I have done differently? Should I have been reaching out more? Should I have got them a different kind of treatment provider? Should I have responded differently? But addiction is a very complex illness. It has so many different causes that none of us are really in control of. Genetics play a very significant role. Then there are early childhood experiences. There's psychological vulnerability. There are biological responses to alcohol and other substances that for some people, the nature of their response and how much of a substance it takes for their body to respond like most people's bodies do is potentially a risk factor. These are all things that parents cannot control. We all do the best that we can. And it's hard to make peace with when somebody ends up in a very severe addiction situation like Matthew Perry. But I think that his take on it and the fact that he was very aware and carried with him his own sense of guilt and awareness of how his addiction was affecting his family. And if he was really in control of it, he would have put a stop to it long before, because he truly sounded very connected to his entire family and didn't want them to suffer. But in addiction, you often feel like you just can't control yourself. So long and short, Matthew Perry's life was cut short through a very sad fusion of severe addiction history and virtually unrestricted access to a substance with the potential to be addictive, toxic, and lethal. But as he has been quoted as having said less than a year before he died, when he was asked about how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "The best thing about me, bar none, is that if an alcoholic or drug addict comes up to me and says, 'Will you help me?' I can say yes and follow up and do it. When I die, I don't want friends to be the first thing that's mentioned. I want that to be the first thing that's mentioned, and I'm going to live the rest of my life proving that." And when he came out of that lonely hiding and published his book and told his truth, that really did bring his intention to life. And while his time to live by his intentions was cut short, if we pay attention to what he shared, the lives that it will save will indeed be his legacy. Here are the key things that I want you to take away from our conversation today. The first is, as long as addiction is your secret, it can remain in control of you. Don't let the shame or fear of living without that substance keep you in the cycle of secrecy and perpetual sickness. It's often that shame combined with the fear, how am I going to live life without this substance? Because as I've spoken about in the past, people have a love-hate relationship with substances that they're addicted to. On the one hand, they hate it because it's ruining their life. But on the other hand, it's hard for them to imagine life without it. So the really important takeaway here is that there is hope for recovery. People do recover from this illness. More people do than you think. There are studies showing that 3 out of 4 people who say that they've ever lived with an addiction are currently in recovery. So that's a much bigger number than most of us would tend to associate in our minds with addiction recovery. So the truth of it is, if you release that secret and let it be known so that you can get the help that you need, that's putting you that much closer to being in the driver's seat of your life. The second key thing I learned is that the loneliness of addiction is core to sustaining it. Matthew Perry described this very clearly, was that his addiction got so much stronger in the situations and the periods of time in his life when he effectively isolated himself. And really, support is the antidote to this. We've seen it from one study to the next, that social support is a major source of healing and recovery, regardless of the type of therapy that a person engages in. So if you're addicted to something, do not try to overcome it alone. If you love someone who's addicted, let them know that you see what is happening. You have to choose your moments to do that. You can't do it necessarily every day. You have to have the emotional kind of energy and fortitude to sit through some difficult conversations. But you want to make a point of letting them know with some regularity that you see what's happening to them and that you're there to help and support them. And that's going to go a longer way than it sometimes feels like in the moment. And then third and finally, if you give yourself the opportunity to recover, you can revisit and redefine your life's meaning and purpose. It doesn't have to be to help others fight addiction. That's nice and that's amazing. That became Matthew Perry's mission, but it's really waiting to be discovered, and it really can solidify your future in recovery once you get there. I hope you learned something valuable, and I look forward to seeing you next time.